A Lost Lover, a short story by Sarah O. Jewett. For a great many years it had been understood in Longfield that Miss Horatia Dane once had a lover, and that he had been lost at sea. By little and little, in one way and another, her acquaintances had found out or made up the whole story, and Miss Dane stood in the position, not of an unmarried woman exactly, but rather of having spent most of her life in a long and lonely widowhood. She looked like a person with a history, strangers often said, as if we each did not have a history. And her own unbroken reserve about this romance of hers gave everybody the more respect for it. The Longfield people paid willing deference to Miss Dane. Her family had always been one that could be liked and respected, and she was the last that was left in the old home of which she was so fond. This was a high, square house, with a row of pointed windows in its roof, a peaked porch in front, with some lilac bushes around it, and down by the road was a long, orderly procession of poplars, like a row of sentinels standing guard. She had lived here alone since her father's death, 20 years before. She was a kind, just woman, whose pleasures were of a stately and sober sort, and she seemed not unhappy in her loneliness, though she sometimes said gravely that she was the last of her family, as if the fact had a great sadness for her. She had some middle-aged and elderly cousins living at a distance, and they came occasionally to see her. But there had been no young people staying in the house for many years until this summer, when the daughter of her youngest cousin had written to ask if she might come to make a visit. She was a motherless girl of 20, both older and younger than her years. Her father and brother, who were civil engineers, had taken some work upon the line of a railway in the far western country. Nellie had made many long journeys with them before and since she had left school, and she had meant to follow them now, after she had spent a fortnight with the old cousin whom she had not seen since her childhood. Her father had laughed at the visit as a freak, and had warned her of the dullness and primness of Longfield. But the result was that the girl found herself very happy in the comfortable home. She was still her own free, unfettered, lucky and sunshiny self, and the old house was so much pleasanter for the girlish face and life that Miss Horatia had, at first timidly and then most heartily, begged her to stay for the whole summer, or even the autumn, until her father was ready to come east. The name of Dane was very dear to Miss Horatia, and she grew fonder of her guest. When the village people saw her glance at the girl affectionately, as they sat together in the family pew of a Sunday, or saw them walking together after tea, they said it was a good thing for Miss Horatia. How bright she looked, and no doubt she would leave all her money to Nellie Dane if she played her cards well. But we will do Nellie justice and say that she was not mercenary. She would have scorned such a thought. She had grown to have a great love for her cousin Horatia, and she liked to please her. She idealized her, I have no doubt, and her repression, her grave courtesy, and rare words of approval had a great fascination for a girl who had just been used to people who chattered and were upon most intimate terms with you directly and could forget you with equal ease. And Nellie liked having so admiring and easily pleased an audience as Miss Dane and her old servant Melissa. She liked to be queen of her company. She had so many gay, bright stories of what had happened to herself and her friends. Besides, she was clever with her needle, and had all those practical gifts which elderly women approve so heartily in girls. They liked her pretty clothes. She was sensible and economical and busy. They praised her to each other and to the world, and even stubborn old Andrew, the man to whom Miss Horatia herself spoke with deference, would do anything she asked. Nellie would by no means choose so dull a life as this for the rest of her days, but she enjoyed it immensely for the time being. She instinctively avoided all that would shock the grave dignity and old-school ideas of Miss Dane, and somehow she never had felt happier or better satisfied with life. I think it was because she was her best and most ladylike self. It was not long before she knew the village people almost as well as Miss Dane did, and she became a very great favourite, as a girl so easily can who is good-natured and pretty and well-versed in city fashions. Who has that tact and cleverness that come to such a nature from going about the world and knowing many people. She had not been in Longfield many weeks before she heard something of Miss Dane's love story, for one of her new friends said, in a confidential moment, "Does your cousin ever speak to you about the young man to whom she was engaged to be married?" And Nellie answered, no, with great wonder, and not without regret at her own ignorance. After this, she kept her eyes and ears open for whatever news of this lover's existence might be found. At last it happened one day that she had a good chance for a friendly talk with Melissa, for who should know about the family affairs better than she? Miss Horatia had taken her second-best parasol with a deep fringe and had gone majestically down the street to do some morning errands which she could trust to no one. Melissa was shelling peas at the shady kitchen doorstep, and Nellie came strolling round from the garden along the clean-swept flagstones and sat down to help her. Melissa moved along with a grim smile to make room for her. "You needn't bother yourself," said she. "I've nothing else to do. You'll green your fingers all over." But she was evidently pleased to have company. "My fingers will wash," said Nellie, "and I've nothing else to do either. Please push the basket this way a little, or I shall scatter the pods, and then you will scold." She went to work busily, while she tried to think of the best way to find out the story she wished to hear. "There," said Melissa. "I never told Miss Horatia to get some citron, and I settled yesterday to make some pound cake this forenoon after I got dinner along a piece. She's most out of mustard, too. She's set about having mustard to eat with her beef, just as the old colonel was before her. I never saw any other folks eat mustard with their roast beef, but every family has their own tricks. I tied a thread round my left-hand little finger purpose to remember that citron before she came down this morning. I hope I ain't losing my faculties." It was seldom that Melissa was so talkative as this at first. She was clearly in a talkative mood. "Melissa," asked Nellie with great bravery, after a minute or two of silence, "who was it that my cousin Horatia was going to many? It's odd that I shouldn't know, but I don't remember Father's ever speaking of it, and I shouldn't think of asking her." "I suppose it'll seem strange to you," said Melissa, beginning to shell the peas a great deal faster. "But as many years as I have lived in this house with her, her mother, the old lady, fetched me up. I never knew Miss Horatia to say a word about him, but there, she knows I know, and we've got an understanding on many things we never talk over as some folks would. I've heard about it from other folks. She was visiting her great-aunt in Salem when she met with him. His name was Carrick, and it was presumed they was going to be married when he came home from the voyage he was lost on. He had the promise of going out master of a new ship. They didn't keep company long. It was made up of a sudden, and folks here didn't get hold of the story till some time after. I've heard some that ought to know say it was only talk, and they never were engaged to be married no more than I am." "You say he was lost at sea?" asked Nellie. "The ship never was heard from. They supposed she was run down in the night out in the South Seas somewhere. It was a good while before they gave up expecting news, but none ever come. I think she set everything by him and took it very hard losing of him. But there, she'd never say a word. You're the freest-spoken Dane I ever saw, but you may take it from our mother's folks. I know he gave her that whale's tooth with the ship drawn on it that's on the mantelpiece in her room. She may have a sight of other keepsakes for all I know, but it ain't likely." And here there was a pause, in which Nellie grew sorrowful as she thought of the long waiting for tidings of the missing ship, and of her cousin's solitary life. It was very odd to think of prim Miss Horatia's being in love with a sailor. There was a young lieutenant in the Navy whom Nellie herself liked dearly, and he had gone away on a long voyage. "Perhaps she's been just as well off," said Melissa. "She's dreadful set, your cousin Horatia is, and sailors is high-tempered men. I've heard it hinted that he was a fast fellow, and if a woman's got a good home like this, and's able to do for herself, she'd better stay there. I ain't going to give up a certainty for an uncertainty. That's what I always tell 'em," added Melissa with great decision, as if she were besieged by lovers. But Nellie smiled inwardly as she thought of the courage it would take to support anyone who wished to offer her companion his heart and hand. It would need desperate energy to scale the walls of that garrison. The green peas were all shelled presently, and Melissa said gravely that she should have to be lazy now until it was time to put in the meat. She wasn't used to being helped, unless there was extra work, and she calculated to have one piece of work join on to another. However, it was no account, and she was obliged for the company, and Nellie laughed merrily as she stood washing her hands in the shining old copper basin at the sink. The sun would not be round that side of the house for a long time yet, and the pink and blue morning glories were still in their full bloom and freshness. They grew over the window, twined on strings exactly the same distance apart. There was a box crowded full of green house leeks down at the side of the door. They were straying over the edge, and Melissa stooped stiffly down with an air of disapproval at their untidiness. "They straggle all over everything," said she, "and they're no kind of use, only Mrs. Mother she set everything by 'em. She fetched 'em from home with her when she was married. Her mother kep' a box, and they came from England. Folks used to say they was good for bee stings." Then she went into the inner kitchen, and Nellie went slowly away along the flagstones to the garden from whence she had come. The garden gate opened with a tired creak and shut with a clack, and she noticed how smooth and shiny the wood was where the touch of so many hands had worn it. There was a great pleasure to this girl in finding herself among such old and well-worn things. She had been for a long time in cities or at the West, and among the old fashions and ancient possessions of Longfield, it seemed to her that everything had its story, and she liked the quietness and unchangeableness with which life seemed to go on from year to year. She had seen many a dainty or gorgeous garden, but never one that she had liked so well as this, with its herb bed and its broken rows of currant bushes, its tall stalks of white lilies and its wandering rose bushes and honeysuckles that had bloomed beside the straight paths for so many more summers than she herself had lived. She picked a little nosegay of late red roses and carried it into the house to put on the parlour table. The wide hall door was standing open, with its green outer blinds closed, and the old hall was dim and cool. Miss Horatia did not like a glare of sunlight, and she abhorred flies with her whole heart. Nellie could hardly see her way through the rooms, it had been so bright out of doors. But she brought the tall champagne glass of water from the dining room and put the flowers in their place. Then she looked at two silhouettes which stood on the mantel in carved ebony frames. They were portraits of an uncle of Miss Dane and his wife. Miss Dane had thought Nellie looked like this uncle the evening before. She could not see the likeness herself, but the pictures suggested something else, and she turned suddenly and went hurrying up the stairs to Miss Horatia's own room, where she remembered to have seen a group of silhouettes fastened to the wall. There were 7 or 8, and she looked at the young men among them most carefully, but they were all marked with the name of Dane. They were Miss Horatia's brothers, and our friend hung them on their little brass hooks again with a feeling of disappointment. Perhaps her cousin had a quaint miniature of the lover, painted on ivory, and shut in a worn red morocco case. She hoped she should get a sight of it some day. This story of the lost sailor had a wonderful charm for the girl. Miss Horatia had never been so interesting to her before. How she must have mourned for the lover and missed him, and hoped there would yet be news from the ship. Nellie thought she would tell her own little love story some day, though there was not much to tell yet, in spite of there being so much to think about. She built a little castle in Spain as she sat in the front window seat of the upper hall and dreamed pleasant stories for herself until the sharp noise of the front gate latch waked her, and she looked out through the blind to see her cousin coming up the walk. Miss Horatia looked hot and tired, and her thoughts were not of any fashion of romance. "It is going to be very warm," said she. "I have been worrying ever since I have been gone, because I forgot to ask Andrew to pick those white currants for the minister's wife. I promised that she should have them early this morning. Would you go out to the kitchen and ask Melissa to step in for a moment, my dear?" Melissa was picking over red currants to make a pie, and rose from her chair with a little unwillingness. "I guess they could wait until afternoon," said she, as she came back. "Miss Horatia's in a fret because she forgot about sending some white currants to the minister's. I told her that Andrew had gone to have the horses shod and wouldn't be back till near noon. I don't see why part of the folks in the world should kill themselves trying to suit the rest. As long as I haven't got any citron for the cake, I suppose I might go out and pick 'em," added Melissa ungraciously. "I'll get some to set away for tea anyhow." Miss Dane had a letter to write after she had rested from her walk, and Nellie soon left her in the dark parlour and went back to the sunshiny garden to help Melissa, who seemed to be taking life with more than her usual disapproval. She was sheltered by an enormous gingham sunbonnet. "I set out to free my mind to your cousin Horatia this morning," said she, as Nellie crouched down at the opposite side of the bush where she was picking. But we can't agree on that pint, and it's no use. I don't say nothing. You might's well ask the moon to face about and travel the other way as to try to change Miss Horatia's mind. I ain't going to argue it with her. It ain't my place. I know that as well as anybody. She'd run her feet off for the minister's folks any day, and though I do say he's a fair preacher, they haven't got a speck of consideration nor faculty. They think the world was made for them, but I think likely they'll find out it wasn't. Most folks do. When he first was settled here, I had a fit of sickness, and he come to see me when I was getting over the worst of it. He did the best he could. I always took it very kind of him, but he made a prayer, and he kept saying this aged handmaid, I should think, a dozen times. Aged handmaid, said Melissa scornfully. I don't call myself aged yet, and that was more than 10 years ago. I never made pretensions to being younger than I am. But you'd have thought I was a toppling old creature going on 100. Nellie laughed. Melissa looked cross and moved on to the next currant bush. So that's why you don't like the minister? But the question did not seem to please. I hope I never should be set against a preacher by such as that. And Nellie hastened to change the subject, but there was to be a last word. I like to see a minister that's solid minister right straight through, not one of these veneered folks. But old Parson Crowden spoilt me for setting under any other preaching. I wonder, said Nellie after a little, if Cousin Horatia has any picture of that Captain Carrick. He wasn't captain, said Melissa. I never heard that it was any more than they talked of giving him a ship next voyage. And you never saw him? He never came here to see her? Bless you, no. She met with him at Salem, where she was spending the winter, and he went right away to sea. I've heard a good deal more about it of late years than I ever did at the time. I suppose the Salem folks talked about it enough. All I know is there was other good matches that offered to her since, and couldn't get her, and I suppose it was on account of her heart's being buried in the deep with him. And this unexpected bit of sentiment, spoken in Melissa's grummest tone, seemed so funny to her young companion that she bent very low to pick from a currant twig close to the ground, and could not ask any more questions for some time. I have seen her a sight of times when I knew she was thinking about him, Melissa went on presently, this time with a tenderness in her voice that touched Nellie's heart. She's been dreadful lonesome. She and the old colonel, her father, wasn't much company to each other, and she always kept everything to herself. The only time she ever said a word to me was one night 6 or 7 years ago this Christmas. They got up a Christmas tree in the vestry, and she went. And I did too. I guess everybody in the whole church and parish that could crawl turned out to go. The children, they made a dreadful racket. I'd have got my ears took off if I had been so forth-putting when I was little. I was looking round for Miss Horatia, long at the last of the evening, and somebody said they'd seen her go home. I hurried, and I couldn't see any light in the house, and I was afraid she was sick or something. She come and let me in, and I see she had been a-crying. I says, "Have you heard any bad news?" But she says, "No," and began to cry again, real pitiful. "I never felt so lonesome in my life," says she, "as I did down there. It's a dreadful thing to be left all alone in the world." I did feel for her, but I couldn't seem to say a word. I put some pine chips I had handy for morning on the kitchen fire, and I made her up a cup of good hot tea, quick's I could, and took it to her, and I guess she felt better. She never went to bed till 3 o'clock that night. I couldn't shut my eyes till I heard her come upstairs. There, I set everything by Miss Horatia. I haven't got no folks either. I was left an orphan over to Deerfield, where Mrs. Mother come from, and she took me out of the town farm to bring up. I remember when I come here I was so small I had a box to stand up on when I helped wash the dishes. There's nothing I ain't had to make me comfortable, and I do just as I'm a mind to, and call in extra help every day of the week if I give the word. But I've had my lonesome times, and I guess Miss Horatia knew. Nellie was very much touched by this bit of a story. It was a new idea to her that Melissa should have so much affection and be so sympathetic. People never will get over being surprised that chestnut burrs are not as rough inside as they are outside, and the girl's heart warmed toward the old woman who had spoken with such unlooked-for sentiment and pathos. Melissa went to the house with her basket, and Nellie also went in, but only to put on another hat and see if it was straight, in a minute spent before the old mirror, and then she hurried down the long, elm-shaded street to buy a pound of citron for the cake. She left it on the kitchen table when she came back, and nobody ever said anything about it. Only there were 2 delicious pound cakes, a heart and a round, on a little blue china plate beside Nellie's plate at tea. After tea, Nellie and Miss Dane sat in the front doorway, the elder woman in a high-backed armchair and the younger on the doorstep. The tree toads and crickets were tuning up heartily, the stars showed a little through the trees, and the elms looked heavy and black against the sky. The fragrance of the white lilies in the garden blew through the hall. Miss Horatia was tapping the ends of her fingers together. Probably she was not thinking of anything in particular. She had had a very peaceful day, with the exception of the currants, and they had after all gone to the parsonage some time before noon. Beside this, the minister had sent word that the delay made no trouble, for his wife had unexpectedly gone to Downton to pass the day and night. Miss Horatia had received the business letter for which she had been looking for several days, so there was nothing to regret deeply for that day, and there seemed to be nothing for one to dread on the morrow. "Cousin Horatia," asked Nellie, "are you sure you like having me here? Are you sure I don't trouble you?" "Of course not," said Miss Dane, without a bit of sentiment in her tone. "I find it very pleasant having young company, though I am used to being alone, and I don't mind it so much as I suppose you would." "I should mind it very much," said the girl softly. "You would get used to it as I have," said Miss Dane. "Yes, dear, I like having you here better and better. I hate to think of your going away." And she smoothed Nellie's hair as if she thought she might have spoken coldly at first and wished to make up for it. This rare caress was not without its effect. "I don't miss Father and Dick so very much," owned Nellie frankly, "because I have grown used to their coming and going. But sometimes I miss people. Cousin Horatia, did I ever say anything to you about George Forrest?" "I think I remember the name," answered Miss Dane. "He is in the Navy, and he has gone a long voyage, and I think everything of him. I missed him awfully, but it is almost time to get a letter from him." "Does your father approve of him?" asked Miss Dane with great propriety. "You are very young yet, and you must not think of such a thing carelessly. I should be so much grieved if you threw away your happiness." "Oh, we are not really engaged," said Nellie, who felt a little chilled. "I suppose we are too. Only nobody knows yet. Yes, Father knows him as well as I do, and he is very fond of him. Of course I should not keep it from Father, but he guessed at it himself. Only it's such a long cruise, Cousin Horatia, 3 years, I suppose, away off in China and Japan." "I have known longer voyages than that," said Miss Dane, with a quiver in her voice, and she rose suddenly and walked away, this grave, reserved woman who seemed so contented and so comfortable. But when she came back, she asked Nellie a great deal about her lover, and learned more of the girl's life than she ever had before. And they talked together in the pleasantest way about this pleasant subject, which was so close to Nellie's heart, until Melissa brought the candles at 10 o'clock, that being the hour of Miss Dane's bedtime. But that night Miss Dane did not go to bed at 10. She sat by the window in her room thinking. The moon rose late, and after a little while she blew out her candles, which were burning low. I suppose that the years which had come and gone since the young sailor went away on that last voyage of his had each added to her affection for him. She was a person who clung the more fondly to youth as she left it the farther behind. This is such a natural thing. The great sorrows of our youth sometimes become the amusements of our later years. We can only remember them with a smile. We find that our lives look fairer to us, and we forget what used to trouble us so much when we look back. Miss Dane certainly had come nearer to truly loving the sailor than she had anyone else, and the more she had thought of it, the more it became the romance of her life. She no longer asked herself, as she often had done in middle life, whether, if he had lived and had come home, she would have loved and married him. She had minded less and less, year by year, knowing that her friends and neighbours thought her faithful to the love of her youth. Poor, gay, handsome Joe Carrick! How fond he had been of her, and how he had looked at her that day he sailed away out of Salem harbour on the ship Chevalier. If she had only known that she never should see him again, poor fellow. But as usual, her thoughts changed their current a little at the end of her reverie. Perhaps, after all, loneliness was not so hard to bear as other sorrows. She had had a pleasant life, God had been very good to her, and had spared her many trials, and granted her many blessings. She would try and serve him better. "I am an old woman now," she said to herself. "Things are better as they are. God knows best, and I never should have liked to be interfered with." Then she shut out the moonlight and lighted her candles again, with an almost guilty feeling. "What should I say if Nellie sat up till nearly midnight looking out at the moon?" thought she. "It is very silly, but it is such a beautiful night. I should like to have her see the moon shining through the tops of the trees." But Nellie was sleeping the sleep of the just and sensible in her own room. Next morning at breakfast, Nellie was a little conscious of there having been uncommon confidences the night before. But Miss Dane was her usual calm and somewhat formal self, and proposed their making a few calls after dinner if the weather were not too hot. Nellie at once wondered what she had better wear. There was a certain black grenadine which Miss Horatia had noticed with approval, and she remembered that the lower ruffle needed hemming, and made up her mind that she would devote most of the time before dinner to that and to some other repairs. So, after breakfast was over, she brought the dress downstairs with her work-box and settled herself in the dining room. Miss Dane usually sat there in the morning. It was a pleasant room, and she could keep an unsuspected watch over the kitchen and Melissa, who did not need watching in the least. I dare say it was for the sake of being within the sound of a voice. Miss Dane marched in and out that morning. She went upstairs and came down again, and she was busy for a while in the parlour. Nellie was sewing steadily by a window, where one of the blinds was a little way open and tethered in its place by a string. She hummed a tune to herself over and over. "What will you do, love, when I'm going, with white sails flowing the seas beyond?" And old Melissa, going to and fro at her work in the kitchen, grumbled out bits of an ancient psalm tune at intervals. There seemed to be some connection between these fragments in her mind. It was like a ledge of rock in a pasture that sometimes runs under the ground and then crops out again. I think it was the tune of Wyndham. Nellie found there was a good deal to be done to the grenadine dress when she looked it over critically, and she was very diligent. It was quiet in and about the house for a long time, until suddenly she heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming in from the road. The side door was in a little entry between the room where Nellie sat and the kitchen, and the newcomer knocked loudly. "A tramp," said Nellie to herself, while Melissa came to open the door, wiping her hands hurriedly on her apron. "I wonder if you couldn't give me something to eat," said the man. "I suppose I could," answered Melissa. "Will you step in?" Beggars were very few in Longfield, and Miss Dane never wished anybody to go away hungry from her house. It was off the grand highway of tramps, but they were by no means unknown. Melissa searched among her stores, and Nellie heard her putting one plate after another on the kitchen table, and thought that the breakfast promised to be a good one, if it were late. "Don't put yourself out," said the man, as he moved his chair nearer. "I put up at an old barn 3 or 4 miles above here last night, and there didn't seem to be very good board there." "Going far?" inquired Melissa concisely. "Boston," said the man. "I'm a little too old to travel afoot. Now, if I could go by water, it would seem nearer. I'm more used to the water. This is a royal good piece of beef. I suppose couldn't put your hand on a mug of cider?" This was said humbly, but the tone failed to touch Melissa's heart. "No, I couldn't," said she decisively. So there was an end of that, and the conversation seemed to flag for a time. Presently Melissa came to speak to Miss Dane, who had just come downstairs. "Could you stay in the kitchen a few minutes?" she whispered. "There's an old creature there that looks foreign. He came to the door for something to eat, and I gave it to him. But he's miserable-looking, and I don't like to leave him alone. I'm just in the midst of dressing the chickens. He'll be through pretty quick, according to the way he's eating now." Miss Dane followed her without a word, and the man half rose and said, "Good morning, madam," with unusual courtesy. And when Melissa was out of hearing, he spoke again. "I suppose you haven't any cider?" To which his hostess answered, "I couldn't give you any this morning," in a tone that left no room for argument. He looked as if he had had a great deal too much to drink already. "How far do you call it from here to Boston?" he asked, and was told that it was 80 miles. "I'm a slow traveller," said he. "Sailors don't take much to walking." Miss Dane asked him if he had been a sailor. "Nothing else," replied the man, who seemed much inclined to talk. He had been eating like a hungry dog, as if he were half-starved, a slouching, red-faced, untidy-looking old man, with some traces of former good looks still to be discovered in his face. "Nothing else. I ran away to sea when I was a boy, and I followed it until I got so old they wouldn't ship me even for cook." There was something in his being for once so comfortable. Perhaps it was being with a lady like Miss Dane, who pitied him, that lifted his thoughts a little from their usual low level. "It's drink that's been the ruin of me," said he. "I ought to have been somebody. I was nobody's fool when I was young. I got to be mate of a first-rate ship, and there was some talk of my being captain before long. She was lost that voyage, and 3 of us were all that was saved. We got picked up by a Chinese junk. She had the plague aboard of her, and my mates died of it, and I was sick. It was a hell of a place to be in. When I got ashore, I shipped on an old bark that pretended to be coming round the Cape, and she turned out to be a pirate. I just went to the dogs, and I've been from bad to worse ever since." "It's never too late to mend," said Melissa, who came into the kitchen just then for a string to tie the chickens. "Lord help us, yes it is," said the sailor. "It's easy for you to say that. I'm too old. I ain't been master of this craft for a good while." And he laughed at his melancholy joke. "Don't say that," said Miss Dane. "Well now, what could an old rat like me do to earn a living? And who'd want me if I could? You wouldn't. I don't know when I've been treated so decent as this before. I'm all broke down." But his tone was no longer sincere. He had fallen back on his profession of beggar. "Couldn't you get into some asylum, or there's the Sailors' Snug Harbour, isn't that for men like you? It seems such a pity for a man of your years to be homeless and a wanderer. Haven't you any friends at all?" And here, suddenly, Miss Dane's face altered, and she grew very white. Something startled her. She looked as one might who saw a fearful ghost. "No," said the man, "but my folks used to be some of the best in Salem. I haven't shown my head there this good while. I was an orphan. My grandmother brought me up. Why, I didn't come back to the States for 30 or 40 years. Along at the first of it, I used to see men in port that I used to know, but I always dodged 'em, and I was way off in outlandish places. I've got an awful sight to answer for. I used to have a good wife when I was in Australia. I don't know where I haven't been, first and last. I was always a hard fellow. I've spent as much as a couple of fortunes, and here I am, devil take it." Nellie was still sewing in the dining room. But soon after Miss Dane had gone out to the kitchen, one of the doors between had slowly closed itself with a plaintive whine. The round stone that Melissa used to keep it open had been pushed away. Nellie was a little annoyed. She liked to hear what was going on, but she was just then holding her work with great care in a place that was hard to sew, so she did not move. She heard the murmur of voices, and thought after a while that the old vagabond ought to go away by this time. What could be making her cousin Horatia talk so long with him? It was not like her at all. He would beg for money, of course, and she hoped Miss Horatia would not give him a single cent. It was some time before the kitchen door opened and the man came out with clumsy, stumbling steps. "I'm much obliged to you," he said. "And I don't know, but it is the last time I'll get treated as if I was a gentleman. Is there anything I could do for you round the place?" he asked hesitatingly, and as if he hoped that his offer would not be accepted. "No," answered Miss Dane. "No, thank you. Goodbye," and he went away. I said he had been lifted a little above his low life. He fell back again directly before he was out of the gate. "I'm blessed if she didn't give me a $10 bill," said he. "She must have thought it was one. I'll get out a call as quick as I can, hope she won't find it out, and send anybody after me." Visions of unlimited drinks, and other things in which the old sailor found pleasure, flitted through his stupid mind. "How the old lady stared at me once," he thought. "Wonder if she was anybody I used to know. Downton! I don't know as I ever heard of the place." And he scuffed along the dusty road. And that night he was very drunk, and the next day he went wandering on God only knows where. But Nellie and Melissa both had heard a strange noise in the kitchen, as if someone had fallen, and had found that Miss Horatia had fainted dead away. It was partly the heat, she said, when she saw their anxious faces as she came to herself. She had had a little headache all the morning. It was very hot and close in the kitchen, and the faintness had come upon her suddenly. They helped her walk into the cool parlour presently, and Melissa brought her a glass of wine, and Nellie sat beside her on a footstool as she lay on the sofa, and fanned her. Once she held her cheek against Miss Horatia's hand for a minute, and she will never know as long as she lives what a comfort she was that day. Everyone but Miss Dane forgot the old sailor tramp in this excitement that followed his visit. Do you guess already who he was? But the certainty could not come to you with the chill and horror it did to Miss Dane. There had been something familiar in his look and voice from the first, and then she had suddenly known him, her lost lover. It was an awful change that the years had made in him. He had truly called himself a wreck. He was like some dreary wreck in its decay and utter ruin, its miserable ugliness and worthlessness, falling to pieces in the slow tides of a lifeless southern sea. And he had once been her lover, Miss Dane thought many times in the days that came after. Not that there was ever anything asked or promised between them, but they had liked each other dearly, and had parted with deep sorrow. She had thought of him all these years so tenderly, she had believed always that his love had been greater than her own, and never once had doubted that the missing ship Chevalier had carried with it down into the sea a heart that was true to her. By little and little this all grew familiar, and she accustomed herself to the knowledge of her new secret. She shuddered at the thought of the misery of a life with him, and she thanked God for sparing her such shame and despair. The distance between them seemed immense. She had been a person of so much consequence among her friends, and so dutiful and irreproachable a woman. She had not begun to understand what dishonour is in the world. Her life had been shut in by safe and orderly surroundings. It was a strange chance that had brought this wanderer to her door. She remembered his wretched untidiness. She would not have liked even to touch him. She had never imagined him grown old. He had always been young to her. It was a great mercy he had not known her. It would have been a most miserable position for them both, and yet she thought with sad surprise that she had not known she had changed so entirely. She thought of the different ways their roads in life had gone. She pitied him. She cried about him more than once, and she wished that she could know he was dead. He might have been such a brave, good man, with his strong will and resolute courage. God forgive him for the wickedness which his strength had been made to serve. God forgive him, said Miss Horatia to herself sadly over and over again. She wondered if she ought to have let him go away, and so have lost sight of him. But she could not do anything else. She suffered terribly on his account. She had a pity, such as God's pity must be, for even his wilful sins. So her romance was all over with, yet the townspeople still whispered it to strangers, and even Melissa and Nellie never knew how she'd lost her lover in so strange and sad a way in her latest years. Nobody noticed much change, but Melissa saw that the whale's tooth had disappeared from its place in Miss Horatia's room, and her old friends said to each other that she began to show her age a great deal. She seemed really like an old woman now. She was not the woman she had been a year ago. This is all of the story, but I so often wish when a story comes to an end that I knew what became of the people afterward. Shall I tell you that Miss Horatia clings more and more fondly to her young cousin Nellie, and that Nellie will stay with her a great deal before she marries and sometimes afterward, when the lieutenant goes away to sea? Shall I say that Miss Dane seems as well satisfied and comfortable as ever, though she acknowledges she is not so young as she used to be and somehow misses something out of her life? It is the contentment of winter rather than that of summer. The flowers are out of bloom for her now and under the snow. And Melissa, will not she always be the same, with a quaintness and freshness and toughness like a cedar tree to the end of her days? Let us hope they will live on together and be untroubled this long time yet, the two good women. And let us wish Nellie much pleasure, and a sweet soberness and fearlessness as she grows older and finds life a harder thing to understand and a graver thing to know. A Winter Courtship, a short story by Sarah O. Jewett. The passenger and mail transportation between the towns of North Kilby and Sanskrit Pond was carried on by Mr. Jefferson Briley, whose two-seated covered wagon was usually much too large for the demands of business. Both the Sanskrit Pond and North Kilby people were stayers at home, and Mr. Briley often made his 7-mile journey in entire solitude, except for the limp leather mail bag, which he held firmly to the floor of the carriage with his heavily shod left foot. The mailbag had almost a personality to him, born of long association. Mr. Briley was a meek and timid-looking body, but he held a warlike soul and encouraged his fancies by reading awful tales of bloodshed and lawlessness in the far west. Mindful of stage robberies and train thieves, and of express messengers who died at their posts, he was prepared for anything, and although he had trusted to his own strength and bravery these many years, he carried a heavy pistol under his front seat cushion for better defence. This awful weapon was familiar to all his regular passengers, and was usually shown to strangers by the time 2 of the 7 miles of Mr. Briley's route had been passed. The pistol was not loaded. Nobody, at least not Mr. Briley himself, doubted that the mere sight of such a weapon would turn the boldest adventurer aside. Protected by such a man and such a piece of armament, one grey Friday morning in the edge of winter, Mrs. Fanny Tobin was travelling from Sanskrit Pond to North Kilby. She was an elderly and feeble-looking woman, but with a shrewd twinkle in her eyes, and she felt very anxious about her numerous pieces of baggage and her own personal safety. She was enveloped in many shawls and smaller wrappings, but they were not securely fastened, and kept getting undone and flying loose, so that the bitter December cold seemed to be picking a lock now and then, and creeping in to steal away the little warmth she had. Mr. Briley was cold too, and could only cheer himself by remembering the valour of those pony express drivers of the pre-railroad days, who had to cross the Rocky Mountains on the Great California route. He spoke at length of their perils to the suffering passenger, who felt none the warmer, and at last gave a groan of weariness. "How fur did you say it was now?" "I do know's I said, Miss Tobin," answered the driver with a frosty laugh. "You see them big pines and the side of a barn just this way with them yellow circus bills. That's my 3-mile mark." "Be we got 4 more to make? Oh, my laws," mourned Mrs. Tobin. "Urge the beast, can't you, Jeffson? I ain't used to being out in such bleak weather. Seems if I couldn't get my breath. I'm all pinched up and wiggling with shivers now. 'T ain't no use letting the hoss go step this fashion." "Landy me!" exclaimed the affronted driver. "I don't see why folks expects me to race with the cars. Everybody that gets in wants me to run the hoss to death on the road. I make a good average of time, and that's all I can do. If you was to go back and forth every day, but Sabbath for 18 years, you'd want to ease it all you could and let those thrash the spokes out of their wheels that wanted to. North Kilby, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. Sanskrit Pond, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. Me and the beast done it 18 years together, and the creature warn't, so to say, young when we begun it, nor I neither. I really didn't know she'd hold out till this time. There, get up, will ye, old mare?" As the beast of burden stopped short in the road. There was a story that Jefferson gave this faithful creature a rest 3 times a mile, and took 4 hours for the journey by himself, and longer whenever he had a passenger. But in pleasant weather, the road was delightful, and full of people who drove their own conveyances, and liked to stop and talk. There were not many farms, and the third growth of white pines made a pleasant shade, though Jefferson liked to say that when he began to carry the mail his way lay through an open country of stumps and sparse underbrush, where the white pines nowadays completely arched the road. They had passed the barn with circus posters, and felt colder than ever when they caught sight of the weather-beaten acrobats in their tights. "My gorry!" exclaimed Widow Tobin. "Them poor creatures looks as cheerless as little birch trees in snow time. I hope they dresses 'em warmer this time o' year. Now there, look at that one jumping through the little hoop, will ye?" "He couldn't get himself through there with 2 pair of pants on," answered Mr. Briley. "I expect they must have to keep limber as eels. I used to think when I was a boy that it was the only thing I could ever be reconciled to do for a living. I set out to run away and follow a roving showman once, but Mother needed me to home. There weren't nobody but me and the little gals. You ain't the only one that's been disappointed of their heart's desire, said Mrs. Tobin sadly. 'T warn't so that I could be spared from home to learn the dressmaker's trade. 'T would ha' come handy later on, I declare, answered the sympathetic driver, being as you went and had such a parcel of gals to clothe and feed. There, them that's living is all well off now, but it must have been some inconvenient for you when they was small. Yes, Mr. Briley, but then I've had my mercies too, said the widow somewhat grudgingly. I take it master hard now, though, having to give up my own home and live round from place to place if they be my own children. There was Adeline and Susan Ellen fussing and bickering yesterday about who'd got to have me next, and Lord be thanked, they both wanted me right off, but I hated to hear 'em talking of it over. I'd rather live to home and do for myself. I've got considerable use to boarding, said Jefferson, since Mam died, but it made me ache along at the fust on't, I tell ye. Being on the roads I couldn't do no ways at keeping house. I should want to keep right there and see to things. Course you would, replied Mrs. Tobin, with a sudden inspiration of opportunity which sent a welcome glow all over her. Course you would, Jeffson. She leaned toward the front seat. That is to say, unless you had just the right one to do it for ye. And Jefferson felt a strange glow also, and a sense of unexpected interest and enjoyment. See here, Sister Tobin, he exclaimed with enthusiasm. Why can't you take the trouble to shift seats and come front here long o' me? We could put one buffalo top of the other. They're both wearing thin and set close, and I do know but we should be more protected against the weather. Well, I couldn't be no colder if I was froze to death, answered the widow with an amiable simper. Don't you let me delay you, nor put you out, Mr. Briley. I don't know's I'd set forth today if I'd known it was so cold, but I had all my bundles done up, and I ain't one that puts my hand to the plough and looks back, according to Scripture. You wouldn't wanted me to ride all them 7 miles alone? Asked the gallant Briley sentimentally, as he lifted her down and helped her up again to the front seat. She was a few years older than he, but they had been schoolmates, and Mrs. Tobin's youthful freshness was suddenly revived to his mind's eye. She had a little farm, there was nobody left at home now but herself, and so she had broken up housekeeping for the winter. Jefferson himself had savings of no mean amount. They tucked themselves in and felt better for the change, but there was a sudden awkwardness between them. They had not had time to prepare for an unexpected crisis. They say Elder Bickers, over to East Sanskrit, has been and got married again to a gal that's 4 year younger than his oldest daughter, proclaimed Mrs. Tobin presently. Seems to me it was fool's business. I view it so, said the stage driver. There's going to be a mild, open winter for that family. What a joker you be for a man that's had so much responsibility, smiled Mrs. Tobin, after they had done laughing. Ain't you never 'fraid carrying mail matter and such valuable stuff that you'll be set on and robbed, specially by night? Jefferson braced his feet against the dasher under the worn buffalo skin. It is kinda scary, or would be for some folks, but I'd like to see anybody get the better of me. I go armed, and I don't care who knows it. Some of them drover men that comes from Canada looks as if they didn't care what they did, but I look 'em right in the eye every time. Men folks is brave by nature, said the widow admiringly. You know how Tobin would let his fist ride out at anybody that undertook to sass him. Town meeting days, if he got disappointed about the way things went, he'd lay 'em out in Winrose, and if he hadn't been a church member, he'd been a real fighting character. I was always 'fraid to have him roused, for all he was so willing and meechin' to home, and set round clever as anybody. My Susan Ellen used to boss him same's the kitten when she was 4-year-old. I've got a kind of a sideways cant to my nose that Tobin give me when we was to school. I don't know's you ever noticed it, said Mr. Briley. We was scuffling as lads will. I never bore him no kind of a grudge. I pitied ya when he was taken away. I really did now, Fanny. I liked Tobin first rate, and I liked you. I used to say you was the handsomest girl to school. Let me see your nose. 'Tis all straight for what I know, said the widow gently, as with a trace of coyness she gave a hasty glance. I don't know but what it is warped a little, but nothing to speak of. You've got real nice features like your marm's folks. It was becoming a sentimental occasion, and Jefferson Briley felt that he was in for something more than he had bargained. He hurried the faltering sorrel horse and began to talk of the weather. It certainly did look like snow, and he was tired of bumping over the frozen road. "I shouldn't wonder if I hired a hand here another year and went off out west myself to see the country." "Why, how you talk," answered the widow. "Yes'm," pursued Jefferson. "'Tis tamer here than I like, and I was telling 'em yesterday I've got to know this road most too well. I'd like to go out and ride in the mountains with some of them great clipper coaches, where the driver don't know 1 minute but he'll be shot dead the next. They carry an awful sight of gold down from the mines, I expect." "I should be scared to death," said Mrs. Tobin. "What creatures men folks be to like such things. Well, I do declare." "Yes," explained the mild little man. "There's sights of desperadoes makes a handsome living out of following them coaches and stopping and robbing 'em clean to the bone. Your money or your life." And he flourished his stub of a whip over the sorrel mare. "Landy me! You make me run all of a cold creep. Do tell something heartening this cold day. I shall dream bad dreams all night." "They put on black crape over their heads," said the driver mysteriously. "Nobody knows who most on 'em be, and like as not some of them fellows come of good families. They've got so they stop the cars and go right through 'em bold as brass. I could make your hair stand on end, Miss Tobin, I could so." "I hope none on 'em'll get round our way, I'm sure," said Fanny Tobin. "I don't want to see none on 'em in their crape bunnets coming after me." "I ain't going to let nobody touch a hair of your head." And Mr. Briley moved a little nearer and tucked in the buffaloes again. "I feel considerable warm to what I did," observed the widow by way of reward. "There, I used to have my fears," Mr. Briley resumed, with an inward feeling that he never would get to North Kilby Depot a single man. "But you see, I hadn't nobody but myself to think of. I've got cousins, as you know, but nothing nearer, and what I've laid up would soon be parted out. And, well, I suppose some folks would think of me if anything was to happen." Mrs. Tobin was holding her cloud over her face. The wind was sharp on that bit of open road, but she gave an encouraging sound, between a groan and a chirp. "'Twouldn't be like nothing to me not to see you driving by," she said after a minute. "I shouldn't know the days of the week. I says to Susan Ellen last week I was sure it was Friday, and she said no, it was Thursday, but next minute you drove by and heading toward North Kilby, so we found I was right." "I've got to be a feature of the landscape," said Mr. Briley plaintively. "This kind of weather the old mare and me, we wish we was done with it and could settle down kind of comfortable. I've been looking this good while as I drove the road, and I've picked me out a piece of land 2 or 3 times. But I can't abide the thought of building. 'Twould plague me to death, and both Sister Peak to North Kilby and Miss Deacon Ash to the pond. They vie with one another to do well by me. Fear I'll like the other stopping place best." "I shouldn't covet living longer neither one of them women," responded the passenger with some spirit. "I see some of Miss Peak's cooking to a farmer's supper once when I was visiting Susan Ellen's folks, and I says, 'Deliver me from sech pale-complected baked beans as them,' and she give a kind of a quack. She was set in jest at my left hand and couldn't help hearing of me. I wouldn't have spoken if I had known, but she needn't have let on they was hers and make everything unpleasant. 'I guess them beans taste just as well as other folks,' says she, and she wouldn't never speak to me afterward." "Do knows I blame her," ventured Mr. Briley. "Women folks is dreadful pudgicky about their cooking. I've always heard you was one of the best of cooks, Miss Tobin. I know them doughnuts and things you've give me in times past when I was driving by. Wish I had some on 'em now. I never let on, but Miss Ash's cooking's the best by a long chalk. Miss Peak's handy about some things, and looks after mending of me up." "It do seem as if a man of your years and your quiet make ought to have a home you could call your own," suggested the passenger. "I kind of hate to think of your banging here and boarding there, and one old woman mending, and the other setting you down to meals that likes not don't agree with ye." "Law, now, Miss Tobin, lee's not fuss round no longer," said Mr. Briley impatiently. "You know you covet me same's I do you." "I don't nother," Don't you go and say foolish things you can't stand to. I've been trying to get a chance to put in a word with you ever since. Well, I expected you'd want to get your feelings kinda calloused after losing Tobin. There's nobody can fill his place, said the widow. I do know, but I can fight for your town meeting days on a pinch, urged Jefferson boldly. I never see the beat of you men for conceit, and Mrs. Tobin laughed. I ain't going to bother with you, gone half the time as you be, and carrying on with your Miss Peaks and Miss Ashes. I dare say you've promised yourself to both on 'em 20 times. I hope to gracious if I ever breathed a word to none on 'em, protested the lover. Tain't for lack o' opportunities set afore me, nother. And then Mr. Briley craftily kept silence, as if he had made a fair proposal, and expected a definite reply. The lady of his choice was, as she might have expressed it, much beat about. As she soberly thought, she was getting along in years, and must put up with Jefferson all the rest of the time. It was not likely she would ever have the chance of choosing again, though she was one who liked variety. Jefferson wasn't much to look at, but he was pleasant and appeared boyish and young-feeling. I do knows I should do better, she said unconsciously and half aloud. Well, yes, Jefferson, seeing it's you. But we're both on us kind of old to change our situation. Fanny Tobin gave a gentle sigh. Hooray, said Jefferson. I was scared you meant to keep me suffering here a half an hour. I declare I'm more pleased than I calculated on, and I expected till lately to die a single man. 'Twould really have been a shame. 'Tain't nature, said Mrs. Tobin with confidence. I don't see how you held out so long with being solitary. I'll hire a hand to drive for me, and we'll have a good, comfortable winter, me and you and the old sorrel. I've been promising of her a rest this good while. Better keep her a-steppin', urged thrifty Mrs. Fanny. She'll stiffen up, master, and disappint you come spring. You'll have me now, won't ye, Sartin? Pleaded Jefferson to make sure. You ain't one of them that plays with a man's feelings. Say right out you'll have me. I suppose I shall have to, said Mrs. Tobin somewhat mournfully. I feel for Miss Peake and Miss Ash, poor creatures. I expect they'll be hard-shipped. They've always been hard-worked, and may have kind of looked forward to a little ease, but one on 'em would be left lamenting anyhow. And she gave a girlish laugh. An air of victory animated the frame of Mrs. Tobin. She felt but 25 years of age. In that moment she made plans for cutting her Briley's hair and making him look smartened up and ambitious. Then she wished that she knew for certain how much money he had in the bank. Not that it would make any difference now. He needn't bluster none before me, she thought gaily. He's harmless as a fly. Who'd have thought we'd done such a piece of engineering when we started out? Inquired the dear one of Mr. Briley's heart, as he tenderly helped her to alight at Susan Ellen's door. Both on us, just the least grain, answered the lover. Give me a good smack now, you clever creature. And so they parted. Mr. Briley had been taken on the road in spite of his pistol.